The landlord did not heat the store very well. 40 years ago, in March of 1976, my family, who's here tonight, my mother and my father, and my two sisters, left Seoul, and we flew into JFK to become Jaemigyopo. We stayed initially in Elmhurst with my Uncle John and his family in their tiny rental, and not shortly thereafter, we moved into a one-bedroom furnished apartment. My parents stayed in a tiny bedroom, and my two sisters and I, we slept in a bunk bed in the living room. Right away, my parents enrolled us in PS 102, and I started second grade. I didn't speak any English, and if it weren't for my elder sister Myung, who's here right now, who defended me from terrifying second grade girls, I might not have made it tonight. I was very shy, and I barely spoke even in Korean. And I didn't have glasses, and I was very nearsighted. I found school very difficult. Every day, I couldn't wait to get home to my sisters and to my My father and mother were born when there was only one Korea, not two. My father was born in Wonsan in 1935, which is now part of North Korea. And my mother was born in Busan in 1941, which is, of course, in the south. My sisters and I were born in Seoul. My father became a war refugee when he was 16 years old. He put himself through college, and then he worked as a cosmetics executive. My parents met when my father interviewed my mother for a job interview. And my father thought that my mother was pretty, and he asked her out for coffee. Today, this is called sexual harassment. But she did not mind so much because they got married. My parents come from two very different regions. However, despite whatever current political rhetoric or stance that exists today in both Koreas, I know that Koreans from everywhere once shared a common land and a common culture. No matter where we are, whether we're in Bergen County or whether we're in Wonsan, we Koreans come from a 5,000-year-old nation that is culturally and historically rich. And we are a people who have powerful adaptive skills. Our old nation has been colonized, brutally divided, and attacked, and yet we Koreans are resilient, and we have deep, complex feelings for our motherland and for our compatriots. I'm very honored to be here right now. Now allow me to return to the story of my family. My father had studied finance in Busan National University, and before we left the country, he worked in marketing. My mother studied music at Yonsei, and she was a neighborhood piano teacher. They had a middle-class life in South Korea, but my father was afraid that war could happen again, and he wanted stability for his family. But once they came to America, they had to find work. My father was 41 years old, 6 years younger than I am now today, and my mother was 35. They were not old, but they were not young either. They had 3 daughters from the ages of 5 to 10 years old, and they didn't have the skills to find white-collar work here, so like many Koreans, they decided to have a small business, although they had no experience in running a small business. They sold their house in Seogyeodong for $10,000. And with about half that money, they bought a newspaper stand in an office building in what is now called Koreatown in Manhattan. They sold newspapers and cigarettes and candy. And although they did not intend to fail, they decided to start a business on a very small scale. So if they made mistakes, they could somehow salvage their errors and find other work. I'm the middle daughter of 3 girls. I was 7 years old, and I remember going to the newspaper stand with my father on Saturday mornings. He wore a necktie and a coat, just like his desk job in Korea, and he sold the Daily News for 15 cents, and candies like Goldenberg peanut butter chews for a quarter. I thought it was a wonderful place. I still remember how delicious a York's peppermint patty tasted the first time I had one. Back in 1976, there weren't nearly as many Koreans as there are in New York City as there are now, and certainly not as many in this wonderful place in the state of New Jersey. My father felt very strongly that the very few Koreans there were had to stick together. Down the street from the newspaper stand, on 30th Street and Broadway, a man named Mr. Park owned a wholesale jewelry business called Sunny Variety Corp. Mr. Park bought cigarettes from my dad's store, and often he was very short on cash. And he would ask my father if he could borrow a few $100s. He would pay back the money every now and then, but then he would always need a little bit more the next time. Now, there was always something that he had to pay. He had to pay the suppliers, he was a little short on his rent, he had to talk to his landlord. And a few $100s in 1976 is not an insubstantial amount of money when you are selling scratch-off lottery tickets in newspapers for 15 cents. But my father felt that Koreans had to help one another. About 6 months after they had the newspaper stand, another Korean came to my father and said, could he buy the stand from him? Because he needed a job for his younger brother who was coming to America. And my father said yes, because it had always been his intention to run a bigger business. Now, although the newspaper stand was becoming very profitable, he did not sell the store for a profit to the other Korean because the newcomer was very poor. After my father sold the newspaper stand, he went to Brooklyn, and then he went to the Bronx, and he wanted to open a deli. He knew nothing about opening delis. Then one day, Mr. Park, that man who had borrowed money from my father often, came to him and said, would you like to be my partner at Sunny Variety Corp? Now, it sounds impressive to be the partner of a wholesale jewelry business. But in fact, Sunny Variety Corp, which exists, the space actually still exists today, is located on 1235 Broadway, which is on 30th and Broadway. So if you go to Koreatown sometime and you look at 1235 Broadway, you will see exactly the spot where my father worked for 20 years. And now it's South Asians run a perfume wholesale business there. The shop itself was about 200 square feet. So it's about maybe 8 feet by 25, and about twice the length of the newspaper stand. So in fact, my father had improved his situation. There was a glass show window and a glass panel door, and it never got cleaned no matter how much Windex my mother used. And there was an ancient display case, and if you tried to open the door to take the merchandise out, the door always stuck because it was so old. In the very back of the hallway-shaped store, there was a tiny, cheap desk and a metal file cabinet behind a plexiglass panel, and that was the office. The landlord did not heat the store very well. So throughout my childhood, whenever it was winter time, my father would wear 2 cardigans, one on top of the other, because every time the door opened, it was so cold inside the store. Now, during the war, my father had taught himself English from reading dictionaries and by talking to the GIs and running errands for them. But my mother, the daughter of a minister, didn't speak much English. So when she came to the United States, she decided that she would go to NYU and learn English. About 6 months after my father decided to become a partner of Sunny Variety Corp, my father asked my mother to stop by the store. When my mother got there, my father said, "I'm going to go step out for lunch. Can you stay here and don't move? I want you to watch absolutely everything while I step out of the store to have lunch." My mother thought that was really weird.